The Sad Vampire by Angus Campbell. The house was big, very old, and stood on the edge of a desolate moor. John's mother said it was far too large, and heaven above knew how she would keep it clean. But his father was of the opinion that it was picturesque and had a wonderful old-world atmosphere. "And what about heating?" Mrs. Glendale asked. "It'll cost a fortune, to say nothing of decorating. The place is awfully run down." "Only about 6 or 7 rooms are in use," her husband consoled her. "The rest are shut up, but honestly, it's a wonderful old house, and remember, it's been in my family for generations." "Well," Mrs. Glendale sighed, "I was quite happy with our semi-detached in Surbiton, but since you and John are set on living in this place, I suppose I'll have to make the best of it." John, being only 14 years old, thought Glendale Grange the most exciting house he had ever seen. His father had inherited it from a very ancient uncle who had recently died, together with a sum of money that would just about pay for its upkeep, so long as they lived simply. The main part of the house had been built during the reign of the first Queen Elizabeth, but various generations of Glendales had added to it over the course of the past 400 years, so now it was a low, rambling building, with doors opening in all sorts of unexpected places, and long, rambling passages that made the house into a kind of exciting labyrinth. Along with a house full of beautiful antique furniture, John's father had also inherited a housekeeper. She was a very old woman, with a mass of white hair and a shrivelled brown face that reminded John of a pickled walnut. She was waiting in the large oak-panelled hall when they opened the front door. She examined the small family with a cold, cynical eye. "Ah, Mrs. Coombs," Stafford Glendale said heartily. "This is my wife, Mrs. Glendale, and my son, John." Mrs. Coombs hitched up a spotless white apron. "Pleased to meet him, I'm sure. Do you all intend to live in the Grange?" John's father grinned, then frowned. "Yes. Why? Have you any objection?" Mrs. Coombs shrugged. "It's all the same to me, but do you know what you're letting yourself in for? This is no ordinary house." Mrs. Glendale decided to say a few words. John could see she was annoyed at the old woman's manner, which he had to admit was rather rude. "Thank you, Mrs. Coombs, but we are very well aware this is an old and large house, and I'm sure we'll manage quite nicely. Now, I'd be obliged if you would make us a nice cup of tea. After the long journey, we could all do with one." Mrs. Coombs turned abruptly and shuffled towards the door, which John presumed led to a kitchen. In the entrance she paused and looked back over one shoulder. "Tea, is it? Well, let me say this. It's more than tea you'll want before you've been here long." "What an awful old woman!" Mrs. Glendale gasped once the door had been slammed by the departing Mrs. Coombs. "Stafford, I don't believe I can take much of her." But her husband grinned indulgently. "Bit of a character. We will have to make allowances for her funny ways. She looked after my uncle for over 50 years and probably considers the house to be her personal property. I suppose from her point of view, we are intruders." "That's all very well," his wife grumbled, but she could try to be civil. The rest of the day was spent settling in. As the Grange was fully furnished, they had disposed of almost all their own furniture to the buyer of the townhouse. The few items that John's mother could not bear to part with were coming down in a removal van the next day, so all they had to do was unpack a few suitcases and prepare 2 bedrooms for immediate use. Then Mrs. Coombs announced that dinner was ready, and they made their way to the long, cool dining room. The meal was well cooked and greatly appreciated, even if the old woman did serve it with a certain amount of ill grace, shaking her head in a manner of grim warning. It was not until coffee had been served that she dropped her bombshell. "Everything satisfactory?" she addressed Mrs. Glendale, who was not at all happy with the way the coffee pot had been crashed down in front of her. "There are no complaints?" After some thought, John's mother shook her head. "None that I'm prepared to mention at the moment. The dinner was very nice, and you're a very good cook." The old woman drew up a chair and sat down, an action that earned her a glare from Mrs. Glendale and an amused grin from John's father. She ignored both, and after clearing her throat, began to speak. Now, I don't suppose any of you will take any notice of what I'm going to say, but that can't be helped. I'm going to say it anyway. This house has got a vampire. Mrs. Glendale gasped, and her husband tried hard not to laugh. And as for John, he could only gape in speechless astonishment. At length, his mother rediscovered her voice. "What did you say?" she asked. "I thought I spoke clearly enough," Mrs. Coombs said coldly, "but in case you're a bit hard of hearing, I'll say it again. This house has got a vampire." John jumped up and down in his chair, his eyes wide with excitement. "You mean a real vampire, one that sucks blood and comes out of its coffin at sunset?" Mrs. Coombs sniffed. "He comes out of his coffin at sunset, all right. Don't you have any doubts on that score? And as for sucking blood, well, your uncle and me never gave him the opportunity, but I've no doubt if we had been careless, he would have drained us drier than old orange peel." Mr. Glendale made a great effort to speak with suitable gravity. "And what precautions do you suggest we take, Mrs. Coombs?" The old woman almost smiled and nodded with reluctant approval. "I'm glad you've got the sense to ask. Well, first of all, shut your bedroom windows and doors and make sure the catches are fastened and the keys turned. Then lay garlic flowers. Your uncle and me planted a whole crop of them in the kitchen garden, all over the cracks. Oh, and wear your crucifixes round your necks. If you take these simple precautions, you'll be as safe as a cup of water in a river." But John did not really believe in vampires, but he wanted to. "How did the house come to have a vampire?" Mrs. Coombs shook her head grimly. "You may well ask. It's your great-great-great-grandfather, who wouldn't stay at home like a respectable body, but went gallivanting about in foreign parts. Got bitten, he did, by a count somebody or other, and he's been a vampire for the past 150 years. Mrs. Glendale gave John a warning glance. "I think that's quite enough. The boy will be having nightmares, and so will we all, for that matter." "He'll have more than nightmares," Mrs. Coombs interrupted, "if you don't do what I say. Now, do you want me to fetch the garlic flowers?" Mr. Glendale made a strange choking sound behind his hand, but his wife smiled politely. "I'm sure you mean well, Mrs. Coombs, but I do not think your precautions will be necessary. You may be assured that my husband is well able to deal with any intruder that may prowl around the house during the dark hours." "Please yourself." Mrs. Coombs got up. "You might be lucky for a little while. Come to think of it, I haven't heard him stalking around this part of the house for some time, but you can't say you haven't been warned. Well, I'm off. I barricade myself in my bedroom every night at sunset, and I stay there until morning." Scarcely had the door closed than Mr. Glendale burst into a fit of uncontrollable laughter, and even Mrs. Glendale found it hard not to smile. "Did you ever hear the like?" John's father said at length. "A vampire? Garlic flowers in the bedroom? That old dear is as mad as a March hare." "Maybe so," his wife remarked quietly. "But I'm not at all sure that she's the kind of person I care to have about the house. Heaven only knows John has a vivid enough imagination as it is, without having that awful old woman filling his mind with vampires and goodness knows what." "Oh, come," her husband smiled. "You mustn't take it all that seriously. I'm sure John has enough common sense not to believe in vampires." John hastened to qualify his fund of common sense. "Of course I don't believe that real vampires exist, but what?" his mother demanded. "Well, it would be fun if it were true. I mean, a real vampire with long eye teeth." "There you are," Mrs. Glendale exclaimed triumphantly. "I told you so. He'll be having nightmares as sure as fate." But John's father shook his head. "Nonsense. There's no such thing as horror to a boy of his age, only adventure." Mrs. Glendale shuddered. "Well, I wish as much as could be said for me. Heaven forbid that I should believe in vampires, but such talk makes one uneasy. Let's change the subject." John woke suddenly. His room was flooded with moonlight, cold silver light that made every item of furniture stand out like shadows on a floodlit screen. He was instantly wide awake and found himself straining his ears for the sound which had roused him from a deep sleep. From far away he heard the hoot of an owl. But it was not this that had disturbed him. He waited, aware that his nerves were tingling with excitement, and every one of his 5 senses was strangely alert. Then it came again, and John sat bolt upright. A long, drawn-out moan. It came from some distance away, and he might not have heard it if his hearing had not been so acute and the sleeping house so quiet. After the lapse of a few minutes, the moan was repeated, and now it carried an undertone of almost unendurable despair. John got out of bed, put on his dressing gown, slid his feet into slippers, and crept towards the door. The passage that lay beyond was gloomy, lit only by such light as could find its way through a window set in a wall at the far end. John moved very slowly towards this window, and when he at length reached it, peered out onto the garden below. A soft breeze stirred the grass, and the towering trees that stood like mighty sentinels on the edge of the moor shook their heads as though disclaiming any responsibility for mysterious moans. Then the moan was repeated for the 3rd time. There was no manner of doubt. It came from somewhere to John's left, from beyond the end of another passage that led into the disused part of the house. After some hesitation, because suddenly he realised there might be danger, John entered the passage, walking slowly over floorboards that were thick with dust, and tried to peer out of windows that had not known the application of wash leather for many a long year. The passage terminated at a door that was festooned with thick cobwebs and looked as if it had not been opened since the house was built. When John at length succeeded in turning the large brass handle, the ancient hinges groaned their protest and seemed determined to combat his entrance. But at last the door was open, and John stepped into a large room which must have been situated at one corner of the house, as 2 walls, each running at right angles to the other, were lined with tall windows. The moonlight, which was thus permitted entry from 2 sides, bathed the room with a cold silver glow, and enabled John to see the damp-stained walls, the carpet of dust that coated the bare floorboards, and the high, cracked ceiling. He was also able to see and hear the man who sat in one window bay. He was so awfully thin. He had a long, narrow face covered with loose, white, oh, so white skin, framed by long, matted black hair, and lit by a pair of large, sad eyes. His skeleton thin body was covered by a threadbare black suit, and there was a bunch of rotting lace at his throat. His feet were bare, and the toenails were extraordinarily long, as indeed were his fingernails. But the one aspect about this terrifying figure that drew John's full attention was his teeth. The 2 eye teeth were so long they extended over his lower lip and dimpled his chin. He was sobbing. Terrible, body-shaking sobs that made his thin frame tremble like a wind-rocked tree, and every once in a while he broke into a low but perfectly audible moan. John, who was by now very frightened, was about to withdraw, and the vampire, for what else could it be, swung its head round and stared at him with tear-filled eyes. Then it sprang to its feet and went scurrying over to the nearest corner, where it crouched, trembling in every limb. John forgot his own fear and was only aware of a deep pity for this terrified, forlorn creature that was not behaving at all as a vampire should. He moved forward a few steps, and the huddled figure cringed and emitted a wail of terror. "Please," John said softly, "don't be afraid. I won't hurt you, I promise." The vampire spoke with a low, husky voice, rather as though he had a bad cold. "You aren't going to wave a cross at me?" John shook his head. "No, I haven't got a cross." The vampire seemed a little happier, for he ceased to tremble, though he continued to watch John with a wary eye. "You're sure? Everyone I've met in the past 150 years has either waved a cross at me, or smothered me with garlic flowers, or, worst of all, tried to drive a stake through my heart. Everyone is rotten and mean, all because I have the misfortune to be a vampire." "Well," John scratched his head, for he had never considered a vampire's point of view before. "I expect it's because you frightened them. I mean to say, you do go around sucking blood, and people are not keen on that kind of thing." The vampire, realising no doubt that he was in no immediate danger, came slowly from his corner and reseated himself in the window bay. "It's not my fault. I don't really like blood. How would you like it if you had to eat, well, sausages, for instance, for your breakfast, dinner, and tea every day for 150 years? Anyway, I haven't moistened my lips for over 50 years. That's why I'm so thin." John shook his head to express his deep sympathy. "I am sorry. I can see it must be awful for you." "Another thing," the vampire went on. "I can't go out during the day, but have to sleep in a rotten old coffin, which I may say is very cracked and extremely damp. And on top of everything else, I've got rheumatism in my knee joints. Can always tell when it's going to rain because they play up like billy-o." "How absolutely dreadful. My grandfather had rheumatism, and he used to rub his joints with camphor. Would you like me to get you some?" The vampire shook his head. "That's very kind of you, though really I doubt if it would do much good. The fact is, I need nourishment, but I'm determined never to suck blood again. The only trouble is I can't swallow anything else." There was a short silence, while John pondered on the vampire's seemingly insurmountable problems. "Perhaps," he said at last, "I can get Mrs. Coombs to make you some black pudding. I mean to say, that would have the right ingredients, and it would be most nourishing." Something like a smile lit the vampire's white face. "That's an idea. Never thought of that. But do you think the old lady would oblige? Up to now she's shunned me like the plague, and bolts herself in her room every night and puts garlic flowers and crosses everywhere." John thought about this question for a little while. "I think I can talk her round, and I'm sure that under that forbidding manner she's got a kind heart. Also, I hope you don't mind my mentioning it, but your suit is really awful." "What's the matter with it?" the vampire asked. "It was very fashionable in my day. I was buried in it." "Oh, yes, I know, but it is in an awful state. Look, I can probably find you an old suit belonging to my father. It may be a bit large, but you can always roll up the trouser legs and fasten it here and there with safety pins. But however it looks, it will be an improvement on what you're wearing now." "You're really most kind," said the vampire, rising slowly and painfully to his feet, "and I can't thank you enough.
It's nice to know that not everyone has sharpened stakes on the brain. Well, I have a feeling that the sun isn't far below the horizon, so I'd better be getting back to my old box. Do you suppose you could be here tomorrow night? Just in case the old lady sees her way clear to making me a black pudding.
John nodded, pleased that his new friend had decided to trust him. Of course. By the way, what is your name? I can't just call you Vampire.
Archibald, the vampire confessed with some embarrassment. Sorry about that, but my father thought it was a very respectable name, and he wasn't to know I was going to be bitten by Count Thingamabob.
I think it's a very nice name, John said.
Well, it's a matter of taste. Would you mind opening one of the windows? I don't feel like trudging all the way back to the churchyard. My knees are playing me up.
It took John some time and a great deal of effort before he was able to raise one of the sashes, but finally there was a gap some 2 feet high through which crept the cool night wind.
Well, that's enough, said Archibald. Now, help me up to the windowsill.
Surely you're not going to jump, John exclaimed. It's all of 20 feet to the ground.
Oh, no, Archibald replied, not these days, although I can remember the time when a little drop like that would not have troubled me.
John heaved, jerked, and pushed. A not very pleasant job, because Archibald was so thin that there was a danger some of his bones might break if pressed too hard, but at length he was doubled up between the window and the sill. Then he said,
Thanks very much. I'm all right now. See you tomorrow night.
The thin body shrank, the elbows jutted out on either side, and suddenly a bedraggled, extremely lean bat went fluttering out over the garden. It seemed to have some difficulty in keeping airborne, and once or twice appeared to be in danger of nose-diving into a bed of stinging nettles, but just in time a strong breeze sprang up, and the sad-looking bat glided behind some trees and was lost from sight. John closed the window, and after deciding that there was nothing more for him to see that night, he went contentedly back to bed. "Will I make what?" Mrs. Coombes inquired in a loud voice. "A black pudding," John repeated his question. "A big one." The housekeeper seated herself in a kitchen chair and watched her young visitor with shrewd eyes. "I'd be surprised if your mother has an appetite for a black pudding, or your father either, for that matter. Don't tell me you want it all for yourself." "No." John hesitated, then said quickly, "It's for a friend." The old woman nodded, slowly. "So, that's the way of it. You've been wandering around the empty rooms, haven't you, meeting someone you shouldn't? It's a miracle you've got a drop of blood left in your body." "But he doesn't like sucking blood any more," John explained, "and I suggested that a black pudding might do as well and be just as nourishing." Mrs. Coombes patted his shoulder. "You're a brave lad, I'll say that for you. There's not many could face the vampire of Glendale Grange and then be concerned with what might fill his stomach. Well, if a black pudding keeps it away from me, I'll make one with pleasure. But you'd better not tell your parents about it, or they will scream to high heaven, and that's a fact." "Archibald is really quite harmless," John said, "and is very frightened of people. He thinks everyone wants to drive a stake through his heart." "I'm not in favour of driving stakes through hearts as a rule," Mrs. Coombes confessed, "but I'll not say it might not be a happy release. He can't be very happy wandering about by himself in those empty rooms. Now, you run along and let me get on." John next approached his father concerning a suit of old clothes. "What do you want it for?" Mr. Glendale inquired. There's a poor man living nearby who has hardly a thing to wear. I said I'd try and find something for him." John's father frowned. "Where did you meet this poor man?" "Oh, I sort of bumped into him. I don't want you talking to perfect strangers, but I'm pleased to see you're taking an interest in people less fortunate than yourself. You may take my old tweed suit. You'll find it in the big wardrobe." That night, when everyone was asleep, John, armed with his father's old suit and Mrs. Coombes's black pudding, crept down the passage and let himself into the empty corner room. Archibald was sitting in a window bay and rose quickly when his young friend arrived.
"Have you got the black pudding?"
Yes. John handed him the black, thick, sausage-shaped object, and in no time at all the vampire had sunk his long eye teeth into its rich substance and was chewing with every indication of satisfaction.
"Oh, that's good," he said after he'd swallowed the first mouthful. "Not quite as refreshing as the real thing, but it has got the right ingredients."
"And I've brought you one of my father's old suits." Archibald took another bite of black pudding.
"That's nice."
John then asked a question that had been bothering him all day. "What happens to your clothes when you change into a bat?" Archibald chewed while creasing his brow into a puzzled frown.
"I've never thought about it. I suppose they must shrink and change into fur."
"Oh." John digested this item of amazing information for a while and then asked, "What do you do with yourself all night?" Archibald stuffed the last piece of black pudding into his mouth and was incapable of speech for a full minute.
"Mooch around," he said. "Sometimes I go for a little fly about. But I'm not up to any great effort these days. Rheumatism in me wings, you know."
"Wouldn't you like to go somewhere else?" John asked.
"You mean join my ancestors in heaven?"
Archibald nodded.
"Indeed I would, but I can't bear the thought of the stake-through-heart business, and as far as I know, that is the only way we vamps can leave this world. So here I stay."
John realised that this must be a very painful subject for his friend, and quickly changed the subject. "Look, I hope you don't mind me mentioning the matter, but when did you last have a bath?" The vampire looked at him in astonishment.
"Ah, what?"
"A bath, you know, wash all over." Archibald shook his head in bewilderment.
"Certainly not for 150 years, I mean to say. Well, vampires don't. For some reason, we're not keen on water."
John could scarcely believe his ears and expressed his horror by speaking loudly. "That's awful! You haven't washed for 150 years? Why, everyone should have a bath at least once a week. Don't you feel, well, dirty?" Archibald shook his head.
"No, I suppose I must have got used to it."
John got to his feet and assumed an expression of great determination. "You're having one right now. You'll have a shower bath before you put my father's suit on."
"Honestly, I'd rather not,"
Archibald began, but John did not allow him to proceed further. "Not another word. We've got a jolly good shower bath at the end of the passage. It's well away from my parents' bedroom, so no one will hear you. Come along." Archibald looked most unhappy, but he was clearly the kind of person who always does what he's told, for he followed John out into the first passage, even though he continued to voice his misgivings.
"I know that it's silly of me, but I could never abide water. I even get the shivers when I see rain running down the window panes. Do I have to take a bath?"
"Yes, you do." John nodded vigorously. "You should be ashamed of yourself, afraid of water. Why, I could spend all day in the river or swimming baths during the summer." With Archibald trailing miserably in his rear, John led the way to the occupied part of the house, and presently, after putting a finger to his lips to signify the need for silence, he opened the bathroom door. He went over to a small cubicle and turned on 2 taps that were fixed to the left-hand wall. He waited until the water was nicely warm, then turned to the trembling vampire. "Don't be so silly. Take those dreadful clothes off, get under the shower and give yourself a good scrub with this nice bar of pink soap. In the meantime, I'll go to my bedroom and fetch a comb and a pair of scissors. Your toe and fingernails most certainly need cut." Archibald looked doubtfully at the hissing shower, then made a great effort to pull himself together.
"I suppose you're right. I will feel much better after a good wash. It's wrong of me to make all this fuss after you've taken so much trouble.
That's what I wanted to hear, said John. Now, I'll leave you to it. Won't be long. He went out and closed the door, then hurried to his bedroom, where he gathered up a pair of nail scissors, a comb, a hairbrush, and after some thought, a toothbrush. He then made his way back to the bathroom, where after tapping on the door, he turned the handle and entered. "Archibald!" he called out. "I'm back! How are you doing?" There was no answer. Just the continued hissing roar of the shower, which sounded like a violent rainstorm. John tried again. "Archibald, are you all right?" As there was still no reply, he peered into the cubicle. Although he was not at all keen to see Archibald with no clothes on, but the cubicle was empty. "This really is too bad," John said loudly. "He's run away, and after he promised he'd take a bath." Then he noticed the vampire's filthy old clothes were draped over the bath, and Father's tweed suit hung next to them. The first waves of alarm were creeping across his brain when he reached into the cubicle and turned the taps off. He looked down and saw the pile of grey dust that was swirling into the plug hole. Urged on by a feeling of blind panic, he ran from the bathroom and tore down the stairs that led to the lower regions where Mrs. Coombs had her bedroom. After he had hammered on the door for some time, he heard her voice shout, "Go away, you foul monster! I made you a black pudding, but you'll not have my blood!" "Mrs. Coombs," John called out. "It's me, John. Please come quickly. I think something dreadful's happened." There came the sound of bolts being withdrawn, and presently the door was opened to reveal the scowling face of Mrs. Coombs, who clearly was not at all pleased about being disturbed. "Well, what is it? I've had to upset the rule of a lifetime because of you. I've never opened this door before sunrise before. You don't understand," John pleaded. "Archibald, he's disappeared. His clothes are there, but he has gone. Please come." "Oh, very well." The old lady, after putting on a faded pink dressing gown, followed John with exasperating slowness back to the bathroom. There she looked at the grey powder and examined the vampire's discarded clothes with much distaste. Then she nodded grimly. "You mean to say you made him go under a shower bath?" "Yes," John nodded. "He was so dirty. He hadn't washed for over 150 years. "Don't you realise," Mrs. Coombs asked scornfully, "that running water is fatal to vampire? He must have disintegrated." "No," John was near to tears. "He said he was frightened of water, and I made him go into it." "I don't suppose he knew what hit him," Mrs. Coombs said with a certain amount of satisfaction. "The minute he stood under that running water, poof, he was a heap of dust being washed down the plug hole." "Are you sure? He felt no pain?" "Not a bit of it," Mrs. Coombs shook her head. "A happy release, and he won't bother anyone again." John felt much happier. He said he wanted to join his ancestors, but he couldn't bear the thought of having a stake driven through his heart. "I'm certain he's happy now." "So far as I'm concerned," said Mrs. Coombs, picking up the late vampire's suit on the end of a bath brush, "his ancestors are welcome to him. Now you'd best get back to bed and let me get back to mine." John went back to his bed and was soon fast asleep. Next morning he remembered a strange dream. He had seen Archibald, attired in a beautiful white suit, looking very clean, and surrounded by a group of admiring ancestors, and that was not all. He was seated at a table, and before him, on a golden plate, was a fat, gleaming, succulent, and extremely large black pudding.